The video you're about to watch is a preview from one of my courses on fashion designing, available online on Fashion Premier Academy. If you're interested in finding out more about it and enrolling, there's a link in the description below. Okay? Enjoy. Okay, in this lesson, we're going to cover bias. What is bias? Why use bias? Why do we cut fabric on the bias? So let's get started. So let's say that this is our fabric. Here's our roll of fabric, right? We pull out the fabric, and by now we know that this is the selvage, right? These two ends right here. This is the selvage of the fabric, and this is the length grain, this is the cross grain, and 45-degree angle is bias. 45-degree angle is bias. So normally we take our pattern, and here's our grain line, right? The purpose of a grain line, by the way, is so that the factory knows how to lay the pattern onto the fabric correctly. Without a grain line, if I have no grain line, like here for example, I have no idea which way to lay the pattern onto the fabric. But now that I have a grain line, right? The grain line is always parallel to the selvage. Grain line always parallel to the selvage. So it goes in this direction. How do we know it's parallel? Well, here's this line. This is the grain line. If I measure 5 inches from here to the selvage on one end, I have to measure 5 inches from here to the selvage here as well. That will give me a parallel line, parallel grain line. So let's look at it on a piece of muslin or fabric, and I'll show you what this all means. Okay, so here's my muslin. If I take one corner of my muslin and I fold it like this, so that the selvage is now parallel to the roll, okay? Here is my bias. This is a 45-degree angle. And if I take my pattern and I lay the center front onto the fabric like this, this is now on the bias. I'm cutting a pattern on the bias. Now that's one way to cut it, is to fold the fabric like this. The other is to use the pattern open and lay it down at an angle. But without a grain line, I don't know if it's like this or like this, and we're not really sure where the 45-degree angle is for the bias. Let me show you how to create a grain line to make sure that it's on bias. Okay, one way to create a bias grain line is to create a little square in the middle of the pattern. Just take your ruler and measure, say for example, like 2 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches by 2 inches, just like that. Now these are 90-degree angles. So if I take my ruler and I go from one corner of this little square to the other, just like this, I now have a grain line. So going back to the original grain line being parallel to the selvage, if I measure my grain line, say for example, let's see, this is 15 inches, right here, from here to the selvage is 15 inches. If I go down here and I do the same thing, 15 inches, right? Make sure it's parallel. This is now a pattern that's being cut on perfect bias, on true bias as it's known. And once again, if I take my fabric, one corner of my fabric and fold it over this way, my pattern on the fold, for example, would go here. And you can see that the grain line, again, is parallel to the selvage, okay? So now, why do we cut something on the bias? Let's take a look. Okay, so I have marked my bias on this muslin because I'm going to place this bias on the center front of my form. Okay, so I've placed my bias on the center front of the form. Placed a couple of pins here to hold it in place. You see, the thing about bias is that when you have a woven fabric. Here's my selvage. It doesn't give, right? Length grain doesn't give, cross grain doesn't give. But on the bias, it does. It's slightly flexible, if you will. So in fact, I invite you to take a piece of fabric and start draping something on the bias. You will see that it just hangs differently. And in fact, I'm going to continue with this in a minute and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, I'm going to start shaping this muslin right now and get rid of the extra fabric that's not necessary. And I'm probably going to have a dart right here, and again, get rid of the extra fabric that I don't need. So I'm beginning to slim the side seam and the waistline to give it a slim fit. So if I continue shaping this muslin, and see, I can actually pull the muslin and create a nice, beautiful fitted garment here without having to have any fisheye darts to create the shape of your torso. Okay, for the back, it's very similar to what we just did in the front. I have a piece of muslin, right? I have drawn my bias grain line, which will go on center back. So when you're cutting fabric on the bias, the fabric behaves differently than when you cut it on straight grain. The fabric hugs the body, it clings to the body, it fits close to the body. So ultimately, it'll give you a different feeling and a different design. So there you have it, bias. Now you know what it is, its properties, why we use it, grain lines. Get some fabric, start practicing. I will see you in the next class. Ci vediamo in classe. Ciao. Thank you for watching this video. Check out all the courses available at Fashion Premier Academy by clicking the link below. And be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell next to it so that you will be notified when I post new videos, which is every week. I'll see you in class.